I want to delve a little before where Lena entered, which is to understand the background and the context of this so-called integrated profit and loss. And I also want to then delve straight into the deep end and try and speak with you about what this is all about. To me, this is about really measuring corporate performance in tomorrow's world. So in that sense, I think I am privileged and honored that Sveaskog selected me and my team to help them engage with this process, because it is a leap ahead. It is where I think we are moving towards if things turn out right. I want to talk about the role that this so-called integrated profit and loss can play in measuring corporate performance. Why is there a problem? I think Lena mentioned this, that today, in today's world, when we present annual balance sheet and profit and loss, as we all do, as every company does, based on the national and international chartered accountancy regulations, we are really presenting results for our shareholders. We are presenting the net increase or decrease in financial capital owned by the shareholder. But any company has huge impacts beyond that. And I'll describe the context and why that is so important. But the fact that we don't present any of these other impacts on the rest of society means that we are so narrowly focused on shareholder capitalism that we've forgotten that capital, which is about value, it's about wealth, it's about well-being, belongs to other people as well. A company is a huge institution, and its impacts are way beyond that to the shareholder. So that's what today's conversation on integrated profit and loss is about. And let me begin with our broader world and the world of planetary boundaries, which Lena mentioned in her speech. The work on planetary boundaries was done by Johan Rockström and others at the Stockholm Resilience Center and research scientists from around the world. And what they were saying is that, look, the challenge that we face today is that the world is not unlimited, whether it's about resources. We have boundary resources such as phosphorus and nitrogen, which are key nutrients which enter agriculture. We have resources like genetic diversity, which is fundamental to our survival and our discovery of medicines and so on. We have, of course, resources like land and the availability of land for feeding us, clothing us, and providing enough carbon capture through the forests to cover our emissions. We have got resource issues in so many different areas, and we are approaching planetary boundaries. We are approaching limits which are not safe anymore. So the Stockholm Resilience Center and others worked on this idea of a safe operating space between what they saw was an environmental ceiling and what is now being described as a social floor. Because if you use nothing in the Earth's resource, you end up a very unhappy and poor and hungry person, because by definition you can't be eating, right? So you have to use some. The question is, what is the sustainable level of resource use in all of these dimensions of society and the environment? And the challenge is that we seem to be skidding towards planetary boundaries in more areas than one. And you can see some of the obvious ones where on phosphorus and nitrogen, phosphorus depletion. Unfortunately, most of the phosphorus that we use for phosphates for agriculture comes from rock phosphate, which is largely in 4 countries. Morocco happens to have 40% of those resources. And there are, South Africa is another one of them. So you can imagine the next oil is going to be phosphorus, and you can imagine Africa as the next area, like the Middle East, with a lot of socio-political tension. So we clearly have broken the boundary on the use of that, and nitrogen pollution, likewise, we have broken the boundary on that. Others we are approaching, and in the case of genetic diversity, we are losing species and genetic diversity at a rate which is 100 to 1,000 times historic averages for the world's environment. So we do have a serious issue with planetary boundaries. And the question is, who should solve this problem? And the instant thought is, well, government must do about this, but hang on. Most of these boundary issues relate to resource use. Most of the economy today is private sector. Globally, 2/3, and in the US, it happens to be almost 75% of production, that is GDP, and employment is actually the private sector. So if we look at who determines economic direction, who determines resource use, it is the private sector that determines economic direction and resource use. So it's us. So we have to point to ourselves saying, look, we are in the driving seat and we are skidding dangerously in many directions, hitting potentially planetary boundaries. So that's the significance of this challenge. And if we look specifically where is this coming from, you would have heard economists, including myself, use the term externalities. Externalities is just jargon for an impact of a bilateral transaction. Supposing I make a car, you buy and drive a car, maybe you're happy because your family and friends are happy. I'm happy because I made a profit from selling you a car. Maybe you're not happy because the emissions from my car, even though they may be, Euro compliant, Euro 4 compliant, but they're still NOx and SOx, and your health has been affected. Maybe you're not happy because my emissions were part of those that caused climate change, and therefore your land in the Netherlands or in Belgium somewhere got affected and property got destroyed. So you are the externalities of the private transaction of me making a car and selling a car to her. So this is the challenge, that we look at private transactions, we calculate the profits, we are celebrating the profits, but we don't look at the externalities. And the externalities, which are to do with greenhouse gas emissions, water abstraction, and natural resource use, and you can see how many of the natural resource use issues already are approaching problem dimensions. 6 of these planetary boundaries are basically coming out of the resource use issues and the externalities of the private sector. So we do have to be conscious of this responsibility of being in the driving seat and with the challenge ahead of us. Unfortunately, in the driving seat, I mean, if I compare ourselves to driving a ship in the oceans, instead of having an appropriate compass which would enable us to drive in a multi-dimensional space, we are driving in a space which has got public capital, human capital of employees, social capital of society, natural capital of the planet, and physical and financial capital belonging to private and public interests. We have all of that in the space. And we are kind of in a spaceship, and we need actually a proper dashboard like a spaceship has to navigate the space safely. And instead of that, we have something like a mariner's compass. So we are using basically very simple measurement tools like GDP to measure national performance. We are using profit and loss to measure corporate performance. These are oversimplistic tools. It's a bit like trying to navigate a spaceship with a mariner's compass. You know, remember the old style ship's compass? Well, you will have a crash, okay? And this is exactly the problem. We are just not measuring right. So my first point is that we need to fix our measurement toolkit and substantially improve it from what we are using today, because it's simply not capturing reality. Today's toolkit, and to give you a glimpse of what I'm going to talk about, is basically a toolkit which looks at measuring the corporation's impacts, not just in the small, narrow box out here called profit and loss, which is important because shareholders matter. If the company is unprofitable, it cannot survive. If it can't survive, it can't meet its purpose. It's important, but it's not its purpose only. I mean, breathing is important for me. Without breathing, I can't survive. But my purpose is not to breathe. It's somewhat, I hope, more than just breathing. So this is the difference between being profitable and having success in your purpose. There are 2 different things. You have to do both, not just one or the other. And the toolkit that you need to measure whether you are achieving your purpose is a lot bigger and a lot more complicated than the toolkit you need to know whether you've made a profit or a loss. So that toolkit will be something that enables corporate performance to be measured along all these dimensions, not just financial capital for the shareholders, but financial and human and natural capital for private owners like employees, for communities that you work with, and for the public at large. After all, emissions are a global challenge. So it's not as if companies are doing nothing about this. They are measuring, and some of them are reporting as well. But look how difficult we make it for them. So this is a picture of today's reporting. So there are CSR reports which some companies produce for their NGO partners. Then there are non-financial reports which some produce. Then there are financial reports, obviously, that is statutory, so it's required. Then there are sustainability reports, and then there are stakeholder reports. All of these mean slightly different things, but the point is they're all being produced for slightly different audiences. And there is a kind of jungle of reporting that is today's challenge for the manager in the corporation, the sustainability manager, the financial controller. Too much reporting for too many different angles. In fact, what we need is what we know as integrated reporting, which is essentially one report which pulls all these requirements together and reports from the same place to everyone. So the shareholder knows how much financial P&L is made. The stakeholder, the NGO, the society, the citizen, the employee knows what's relevant for her or him. That's the kind of reporting we need. And to do that kind of reporting, we need to graduate beyond what we have today, because here we will have to answer questions like, what's happening to the impacts of the 4 capitals? How much are you impacting the other capitals? You have to ask yourself, is it being done in a way that is consistent with the national level? Because the UN has already begun measuring national performance on the basis of what they call inclusive wealth, which means what's the total amount of natural, physical, human, and social capital. But they measure just 3, physical, human, and natural. So this is already happening at the national level. These reports have been going on since 2012, but it's only a few companies like Sveaskog and several others around the world who have just started and moved forward with this same concept of, look, let's measure performance in all its dimensions, not just one selected dimension. And the other side of the integrated report is that it also talks about risks and opportunities. It talks about impacts and dependencies, and it presents a strategic view. Now, some of the best balance sheets I've read include a little section at the front which gives the strategy, either signed by the CEO or signed by the chair. And that's part of the report. But what we are talking about here is a financially oriented report which has numbers for all of these capital impacts, which has the strategy, and which also has an understanding of the risks and the opportunities. So a risk analysis as well. That would be an integrated report. So let's see what this means in the case of Sveaskog. So if we looked purely at Sveaskog as a machine that makes money for its government shareholder, it's 100% government owned. If we looked at Sveaskog as purely a machine that makes money for the shareholder, we would say, okay, well done. You've made 1.2 billion profit. Good, cool. Next year, please make 1.3 or 4 or whatever. So that's it. Is that it? Is that all that this company is? No, that would be a caricature of a company as large, as significant as Sveaskog. We need to ask many more questions to get the big picture, because with this presentation of financial P&L, which is what law requires, you are actually missing the big picture. Because the big picture is all of the above. It's about human capital of your employees. It's about the natural capital that you are a custodian of. It is about the social capital that is the glue that binds all this together, that enables all of the other capitals to produce incomes. The nature of capital is that it generates some income. Human capital generates incomes called salaries, sometimes bonuses. Natural capital generates incomes. You know, you can sell wood and generate income from that. Physical capital, buildings, machinery, etc., plant and equipment, they generate incomes as well. So all capitals generate income. Social capital is a binding force. It's a glue that pulls it all together. Without social capital, law and order, regulations, you would not have the ability in physical capital to conclude a contract and to deliver and settle transactions. Without social capital, without responsible employers and employees, people wouldn't come on time and do their work. Employers wouldn't pay salaries. There'd be no society left, right? So all of these capitals matter in our day-to-day lives, but we seem to be measuring only these. And with the integrated profit and loss, we have now the ability to start acknowledging, recognizing, and beginning to measure the others as well. So already there is good progress, and what I'll be describing to you, and this is a kind of overall summary so you know where we are coming from. These are the capitals, the other capitals and their impacts, which Sveaskog has measured with the base year of 2016. In a highlight, there's 160, in addition to the physical capital, because let's look at GDP. You have GDP measures all kinds of things, not just profits. There are other elements of physical capital other than just shareholder earnings, so we measure that. Human capital, that's basically the value that training and development provides to employees, so we measure that. That's 160 million Swedish krona. Then there are some 2 large components of natural capital, which are public. This is about generating value for the public at large. So these values are 4 billion and 2.7 billion for climate emissions, carbon capture, and water generation. And then there's social values, which is the use of the forest, gathering of lingonberries, and so on, 2.7 billion. So if you imagine, all of these are very big numbers. At least most of them are comparable even in size to the profit of Sveaskog, and yet there is not a single official requirement from any government to report these. So we are clearly, if we don't present IP&L, we are not presenting the full picture. To me, when companies say, but why should we disclose externalities? I say, look, if you're a responsible company, you answer me this question. Why would you not want to disclose your impact on society? If you're a responsible company, you would, right? That's what is this process that Sveaskog has engaged, is basically what I think every responsible company ought to be doing. So now let's go into the profit and loss statement, the integrated profit and loss statement of Sveaskog, and find out like what is it actually telling us about Sveaskog. So now I'm going to go through each of those boxes that I described to you. This is kind of a summary, so I will dive a little deeper into each of those boxes. So the first one, as you noticed, was what we call, what is referred to as FCX, financial capital externalities, but it's really value addition. Look at GDP today. GDP, when it's measured at the national level, it's about measuring profits plus salaries plus rents plus interest, bank interest paid to banks, plus depreciation, adding it back, plus taxes paid to the government. All of these elements are put together in what is called the income method of GDP, and they are added up, and then you get GDP. But the situation we have today is that a company is not officially required to highlight all of the other elements of value addition. It's obviously got to highlight profits, otherwise the shareholder will be upset. So it highlights that and presents P&L. It's not presenting total salaries paid, rents paid, interest paid, taxes paid, net depreciation added back, etc., etc. It's all there. It's sitting. Your financial controller knows these answers, right? So doing this calculation was not that difficult. It basically means adding up things which already are known. They're calculated, but they're not the thing that you are forced to report. You report P&L. And therefore, we add that back, and we find that actually the total financial value addition, in other words, Sveaskog's official contribution to the official GDP of Sweden, and I'm talking about official because I have not yet come to the invisibles. I have not yet come to the values of nature and society. I'm just saying what's officially there in the country's balance sheet and P&L. There's 2.3 billion actually, and 2017, the latest number is 2.5 billion. Whereas, of course, the profits of Sveaskog are only 1.2 and 1.35. So even the financial value addition is a lot more than just what the P&L number, the net profit number of the company. And as you can see, the large items here, excuse me, there's staff compensation, about 570, 530 million Swedish krona. There's taxes, net of subsidies, about 260 to 360 Swedish krona. So these are the large items, but there's some of all the other elements which are collected together in estimates made at the national level, which are there, sitting here in Sveaskog as well. So that is step one, working out the unreported value addition. Now, please note, so far, this does not include any externalities. We're not yet considering those. And this is only level one, which means this is Sveaskog's operations directly. But of course, if Sveaskog employs a contractor to drive trucks to carry the logs from one place to the other, that contractor also has employees who also have earnings, which also generates, etc., etc. So this does not include subcontractors' work. This is level one, which means a work company and its direct counterparts. We can do a level two, but we haven't yet. But maybe next year you can do that. Okay. Then I come to the things which are invisible. Now, the beauty about nature, to me, the most wondrous thing about nature, and this goes to the huge intellectual challenge we always have between price and value. I think some journalists today asked me that, about price tags on nature. I said, no, we don't put price tags on nature. You can't, because nature basically provides you value. Value is what you receive. Price is what you pay. You obviously pay nothing, right? So there is no price tag. You're just receiving the value. And in receiving the value without paying price tags, you, the country, the government, is forgetting the real value of what it's receiving. So we try and give you value tags as to here's the value we think of what you're receiving, and here's what you'll stop receiving if you neglect it, ignore it, or destroy it. So it's about value tags. And what are these value tags? So when we calculate these value tags, the two big areas where Sveaskog's forests are adding value, from the point of view of society, one is nature and one is society. So one is people. So this calculation is about the value that the citizens of Sweden, the people of Sweden, receive from walking into the forests and from the so-called recreational benefits of forests from Sveaskog, which is about 2.5 billion Swedish krona. And we can calculate this by finding out their willingness to pay for visits. There are various studies done in Sweden and elsewhere. We give these studies to our team, and we work out what is the economically active population in Sweden, and we work out how much is the total area of forests and what is the frequency of visits and so on, and that gives us an idea as to the total value that is ascribed to the recreation that Sweden's forests provide to the people of Sweden. That's a huge number, 2.5 billion Swedish krona. Then we look at other things like the non-timber forest products. And here we are talking mainly about lingonberry and bilberry. Something like 9% of lingonberry and 6% of bilberry in Sveaskog's forests are actually harvested. We have the statistics calculated on the basis of actual measurements done. And they are sold 3/4, 75% in organized markets, 1/4 in 3/4 in unorganized markets, 1/4 in organized markets. So we have ideas of prices that prevail in these markets. So we basically take that, and then we look at the moose hunting that goes on, and we work out the value of moose in different parts of Sweden, north, middle, and south, and we multiply that, and then we look at the willingness to pay. There are studies on that, willingness to pay for roe deer, hunting of roe deer. And we look at also the value that Sami people would derive for their reindeer, effectively in providing grazing rights, ability to graze their reindeer in the forest. So all of these are elements of value that society gets. These are known as non-timber forest products because in one way or the other, they are not wood. And finally, there are some programs, some social programs that Sveaskog conducts. There's one particularly large program, and that also provides some extra value. But the big ones are basically the recreational benefits and the non-timber forest benefits, altogether something like $2.7 billion. So we are already talking about social benefits, benefits to society of accessing the nature that Sveaskog is looking after of that size. If we look at the natural capital externalities, so here we are talking about the benefits that the world at large receives or that Sweden receives when it comes to fresh water. And this can be calculated as follows. So that's the overall forest area. So we look at both the production forests. Sorry, this is the production forest, and we look at the conservation forests. Something like 82% of the area of Sveaskog's forests are production. The rest are for conservation. And the production forests and the conservation forests produce different levels of carbon benefits and water benefits. In the case of water benefits, the conservation forest is much higher per hectare. In the case of carbon benefits, because conservation forests are typically mature forests, they are peak forests, so they are not adding much carbon every year compared to production forests. So that is actually lower compared to production forests. If we take the total areas, which is roughly 3.1 million hectares and 0.6 million hectares of production and conservation forests, and we take the value that they generate based on location by location measurements combined through this map that we've created, then we get some significant numbers as a result of that. 2.7 billion in terms of water conservation and 4.1 billion. Now, in an ideal world, what does this mean? This is based on the social cost of carbon. So this is what would be the cost of carbon emissions if this much carbon was actually emitted as against being conserved by the forest. And these numbers effectively mean that if there were, and there isn't right now, a proper global carbon marketplace, then these would be value that Sweden would actually receive by having forests like Sveaskog's. So this is actual value which in a theoretical world that we all aspire towards, where there are carbon prices and carbon taxes, that's the kind of value that you would get. But of course, right now you don't, because there isn't such a mechanism in place. There's also some negatives. These are the positive externalities. These are the benefits. There are also some negatives, most of which are the emissions as a result of transportation. Logging and transportation has a lot of machinery. The machinery uses fuel. The fuel has emissions. And these are the effective costs of those emissions. But thankfully, these are, number one, they are small. They are less than 60 million kroner worth compared to 4 billion kroners of carbon savings. And secondly, there is some work being done on those, which I will discuss in a minute. We've also looked at the presence of species diversity in the various areas of Sveaskog's forests, and these are based on location measures, but unfortunately they are a little broad. So they don't give us enough depth of information to work out there are only 4 types of areas, the sort of very high biodiversity richness to high to moderate to low. And we feel that more work needs to be done on this in terms of actually mapping the number and the density of species, the mean species abundance in each of these squares, literally across the whole of Sweden. Now, whether that becomes a Sveaskog exercise or an exercise by the forestry sector or an exercise by the forestry sector supported by the government through a government program, I think probably the latter makes more sense than every company do their own thing for their own forest. So I think more work is required in this space, but I'm hoping that as time moves on, we would be looking at that as well. Finally, I want to ask a question about green bonds. How many people have heard of green bonds? Yes, pretty much everyone. And you'll be pleased to know, if you don't already, that Sveaskog has twice issued green bonds, one more recently. And to me, the green bond is not just a nice to have or a nice to do. To me, it's really fundamental, and I'm saying this as a banker. My background is at ANZ and Deutsche Bank, 11 years and 16 years in each of these organizations. When I began my career as a banker, there were things like consortium limits. Bank consortiums had to decide whether a loan was appropriate or not. They would decide the quantum of the loan, and then they would compete amongst each other. You probably remember those days, right? So they would compete amongst each other for the price of the loan, the spread, or the price of the letter of credit, or the price of the guarantee. And then based on that, you would get the deals and the LCs and the letters and the credits and so on. Now, because money markets and debt capital markets and basically financial markets are so deep, so liquid, and so transparent, I mean, they are so accessible that you have 10, 15, 100 different ways of raising money. All you need is a rating, and you need ready bankers wanting to make their little spreads. And that's it. So the purpose of the financing is lost. People hardly ask questions about that. For a change, thanks to green bonds, the purpose has been reintroduced into financing. So to me, the green bond represents a huge change in the attitude of finance, going back to our roots in some ways, asking first, why do you need the money? What's it for? Very simple question that a banker used to always in the old days ask the client and now almost never does. So the what's it for question is because I wish to improve my value chain, because I wish to add sustainable products, because I wish to change energy mix to get more green energy and non-fossil fuel energy, because etc., etc. Half a dozen different sustainability reasons. And these are all valid reasons for green bonds. The IPNL actually can help you answer the questions. For instance, these are the so-called green bond principles. Use of proceeds, establishing them, the drivers, the outcomes, the impacts. Principle 2 is a process for selecting and evaluating projects, green bond eligible projects. IPNL can help you do that. IPNL can help you on the transparency principle because it is basically about transparent reporting of impacts. So the IPNL at the level of the project can actually answer 3 out of the 4 green bond reporting principles that you have signed off to in Sveaskog. And I think this is something, again, that people need to appreciate, that this is the move in the right direction in order to make yourself more frequent and more common issuers of green bonds. And of course, I mentioned the negative externalities, and whilst they're not big in the overall context of 57, 59 million, but they are basically coming out of the diesel usage in Sveaskog because of the harvesting activities. They're not coming from pesticide applications because they don't apply them. And right now there is already a program on waste recycling, and there are some other initiatives which we have discussed with the company in terms of biodiversity maps to identify hotspots for planning production and conservation better, in terms of supply chain engagement programs, in terms of rail transport to reduce impacts, which are being worked upon. So hopefully there will be some positive news even in this relatively small space of negative impacts of Sveaskog's operations. So what are the next steps? Well, these are my opinions. So, I mean, this is for the company to decide, not for me. I'm just a consultant, so I can advise you. But here's what I think you can do. I think you can put together groups of stakeholders. When I say stakeholders, I'm talking about government, NGOs, your employees, society at large, etc. Put together these groups of stakeholders and look at ways to engage them, saying, okay, here's our IPNL. What do you think? Are we missing something? Is there some particular impact or dependency that we should be more conscious of? And hopefully then in the process fine-tune the framework. In other words, what should you measure and why? The framework of the integrated profit and loss. Another thing you could do is improve the information collection. Like I said, even in the financial side, which is relatively easy, it's only level 1. You can take it to level 2. On the biodiversity side, it's about species, right? So there's no dollar price, and there shouldn't be, because it's about ethics. It's about the right to life. It's about the right to existence of species. Economists call this intrinsic value. They usually don't calculate it. It's not necessary. You just appreciate that value and know it's there. But you can measure quantity, you can measure number of species, you can know whether they're going up or going down or remaining the same. There's a lot you can do even if you don't measure value. There are some things that you can't even measure, right? Love and friendship and so on. There are other things that you can measure but you can't monetize, and there are other things that you can measure and monetize. And I think all three has to be done. But ethics and responsibility come into the answer of what should you do and why. The third thing I think you should do is see if you can present this annually, and ideally with a frequency that's not far behind the annual P&L. Now, I know it's easier to calculate, and maybe your financial controller will disagree with me, but it's, at least in my opinion, easier to calculate a financial P&L than to calculate an IPNL. But shortly after the financial P&L, I think once the first round is done and you've gone through that process of discovery in IPNL, I think you can repeat this exercise on an annual basis, because it then gives you an idea of performance. Are we improving? Are we worsening? How are we improving? How much and where? And what should we be doing better? Another thing that can be done is setting targets. And there is one company which already has done that, which is the water utility of Melbourne City. When they did their integrated profit and loss and found that they had 6 million Australian dollars of positive social capital, the CEO set themselves a target of doubling that by 2020. In other words, every year you should target more and more and double this by 2020. His logic? Well, because we are Melbourne City, we have won the Most Livable City Award in the last 6 years of the Economist Intelligence Unit. My bosses, the government of Victoria, are telling me all the time, what am I doing about livability? You prove to me that you're adding social value. That means I can prove to them that I'm adding to livability. That was very straightforward, and that's what they're doing. They're going ahead with this. So I think setting targets is something that's beginning to happen. And frankly, I think public companies, that is companies owned by the government, are probably the best place to begin here. Because it always surprises me when I find governments who own companies are looking at them as if they are just quasi-private sector. Whereas the reason they own a water utility, or the reason they own a power utility, or the reason they own a forestry company is because exactly they are not that. They're providing public services. The forests of Sweden are providing huge, humongous public services. The water utility and power utility in the same way. So these utilities are there, owned by the government, because they're providing some kind of essential service or the other to society. Therefore, why would you not want to measure their social value? Indeed, why would you not want to target that social value and set targets not based on profit and loss, as in go up from 1.3 to 1.4 next year, but go up IPNL from 9 billion to 10, right? How's that? Oof, that's tough. But, you know, at least set a target. You can do that. And I think that is the next challenge for governments, to think about. Within the European Union, the countries have already started to think in terms of the 2020 program, in terms of public wealth and public goods. And the program is focused on public goods and public wealth. Public taxes are supposed to be applied to generate public wealth. Well, if we do that, then we need to measure how much public wealth we are adding to as a result of the financing of our investment in infrastructure and utilities. So this question ought to be asked, in my opinion, by every government in the European Union Commission. And finally, collaboration within this. Why only Sveaskog? There are other, I know there are other forestry companies here. I've just met with one of them. So why not just do a forestry sector initiative? I'm sure Sveaskog can help, and we would certainly want to stand behind you if you do that. That, you know, I don't think we have enough bandwidth to do 20 companies, but definitely if someone from here wants to engage a program, we can be there to support you to do a sector initiative where everyone follows the same logic and creates a template, if you like, a standard and a template for all forestry companies in Sweden to create IPNL in the same way as Sveaskog has created an IPNL, and then to evolve it, because like we are saying, this is work in progress. We've gone this far, we can go a bit further. Why not do this as a sector initiative and not just as a company initiative? So that would be one of my key recommendations here. And frankly, I think that if you were to do that, then you would be living your dream and living your values, which is forestry the Swedish way. Thank you very much indeed. Yes.